Hey everybody, I had a comment request that I'm going to work on today, and the request was, could I take a set of data off of my scan tool from my Camaro and publish or show that, and so that people could use it as a reference. If you're trying to diagnose your own car, what should the parameters look like? So I've got my Actron 9690 OBD1 scan tool. I've got my 1985 IROC Z305 tune port injection Camaro. And so what I'm going to do in a few minutes is I'm going to take the tool, I'm going to go in the car and connect it, fire the car up, and run it as long as, collect data as much as I can. The way this tool works is you have to set it to record, and then it takes a fixed number of samples on the order of like 62 or 63, I don't remember exactly. I think it depends on how many parameters you're taking, how many samples it can get until it fills the memory up. And that's like about a second and a half every sample. So the tool will do 5 sets. So what I'm going to do is go set it up, fire up the car from stone cold, and run a set, and then as quickly as I can I will reset the tool to take a second set. It probably takes, I don't know, it takes a little bit, probably 15 to 30 seconds to reset the tool. And I'll take a second set of data, and you'll see me walk through it until I get the tool filled up, and then I'll stop. And then I'm going to go and I will show you what I can, and then I will post-process it so that I can show you what the final result looks like. Because scrolling through several hundred frames on here is not the best way to look at data. So there is a printing function on this tool. You can print it literally to print to paper, but there is also a way to go out and print it to a file, to a text file that can be manipulated. Alright, I have the tool set up here. I'm getting ready to do record data. And just as a reminder, this is a 305 tune port, all stock except for a slightly longer duration cam, which could affect the airflow a little bit at idle. Second thing to remember is this tool, because of the way this ECM is designed, will run at a higher than normal idle with a little bit advanced spark timing. It's part of the diagnostic setup, and this tool will trigger that. So let's see, record data, and okay, and I'm going to ask it to take the entire data list. Now I can collect 5 sets of data. I may, so here goes. I'm going to trigger it and then start her up. A little bit rough idle, but knowing that the tool is bumping the ignition timing, it's not completely, I'll call it, it's not completely normal. And she's starting to settle in now. It's been running a couple minutes. So when you're recording data, collecting data, it will continue until you hit the enter key again, and it's collecting frames as it goes every second or two. And right now it got to the end, and I'm going to take the second set of data. Okay, so it's finished there. I'm going to just tell it no. I want the whole data list. Let's go. So this should be batch 3. Starting to warm up much yet. Temp gauge is just starting to move. Okay, we're running number 4. about halfway through this phase, I'm going to move it from being in neutral to put it in gear. When I get to the 5th batch, I'm going to give it a little bit of power and see if I'll try to give it some variation. Engine's almost warmed up, coolant temperature's coming up. Okay, we're into the last one, so I'm on the brakes hard. I'm going to just raise the speed a little bit here. That too long and warm the converter up too much, but get you up to 1500 anyway. Let's go back to neutral and take it up a little bit. And I am holding the brake very firmly, in addition to the parking brake, so that the car doesn't move. You have to watch out. You don't want to drive through the wall by putting power on it while it's in gear in your garage. Okay, that's the final set. So now I'm going to go back and do a live, what's our live data look like here? So 3rd gear off, 4th gear off, we're at 164 degrees coolant. EGR duty cycle is 0, we're at 950 it says. In neutral, it says we're lean. Ah, there goes Rich. Alright, well that's the full amount. And now I'm going to take it and go back to, I'm going to pull the tool so we go back to a normal idle. I wish I could do that without having to switch the tool, or without having to disconnect it. But now we're back almost to a normal idle. It takes it a minute to settle down. Okay, well I'm going to go dump the data and see what we got. Now that all the data is collected, I've got all the data here in the tool. I'm going to go and take it into my computer and dump it to a file, or 5 files. There will be a fair amount of manipulation. I've already tried this once and I know it's going to be a lot of work. But what happens is you end up with a list of all of the parameters in each frame snapshot, one right after the other. And they have to be broken up into segments. And so you take that, whatever 20-some parameters, and you'll take the next 20 and you got to move them up into a spreadsheet. And I found a macro online. I can manipulate macros, but it's more time saving if you can find somebody who's already done one. So I found a macro that I could use as a base, and I've edited that macro. And so what I ended up with out of the tool, knowing the size of these samples, you end up with something on the order of about 7,000 lines of data. And so the macro I can put in Excel and I can hit a button and it'll take that data and spread it across the page, and then I'll manipulate the fields and turn it into something useful. And then once I've got it in that form, I can plot the data and put it into some charts so you can see how it goes. And let's see how it looks. I'll be back with some data once it's been processed. If you're curious what the tool puts out as a data file, what I had to work with from the start, if you look at this, it's a text file. I set it into a text format. It gives you a little header, and then you get these frames of data. So at each time interval, it does a frame. So here's a -4 frame, a -3 frame, a -2 frame, and then it gets to 0, which is where I said start recording. And so what you end up with is all of these frames. And if I remember correctly, it was on the order of 7,000 frames to get all the data from 5 data sets. Okay, I'm back with my processed data out of the scan tool. And this is the first page of about a dozen. I'm not sure the best way to show this to you, but what I will do is I'm going to walk through the spreadsheet data first, and then I've turned this into some graphs and plots that will hopefully make it a little bit more meaningful. Let me start with this first page, and I have taken the data from the scan tool. I used a macro to break it up and convert it into so that all the data was all together and by category. Actually, it's a little bit of minutia, but the macro made it all into lines based on the titles. So I had all the time going across and all the engine RPM going across. And then I had to transpose the data to make it vertical. So I could work with columns of data because that works a little easier, at least for me. And then I've gone in and manually rearranged the columns in what I thought was a little more reasonable sequence. Because there are some things like high battery.
I don't have high battery anywhere through here. I don't have AC requests or fan requests, third gear. None of these columns changed. Uh, so basically everything over here from column Q to the right is static, but I left it in the picture so you could see what it was. And then I put all of the active columns over here to the left. And again, kind of tried to put them in alignment. You'll notice over here there's one called mass airflow grams per second raw and adjusted. It's a factor of 256, multiplier divide by 256. I had someone, when I was going through this on a forum trying to understand my tool, this person had some access to specifications, and he said the way the data is collected, it's how it's binned in digital format, and they had a I'm going to call it the it's like the whole numbers was in one bin, electronic bin, and the fractional part of the grams was in a separate bin, and the calculation was to add them together, and that's what you got in this column. And then to make it accurate, that digital value needed to be divided by 256. And apparently my scan tool doesn't divide by 256, so you end up with this number that looks rather large. So if you correct it, when the engine is off and you're at time 0 and there's no airflow, it's like its minimum value is this 991. That's what the scan tool will display, and it would convert to about 3.8. So what you'll see in this page is the first of 3 or 4 rows you see 0, or first 3 rows you see 0, because I haven't cranked the engine yet. And when you get to line number 5, IAC is wide open at 145, and here's where I'm cranking the engine. You can see that the airflow is starting to respond. The injector pulse width is almost, I was going to say almost off the charts. I'm not sure what it ends up at wide open throttle, but it goes to 10.9, which is giving you a really good rich shot when you're going to go start. The exhaust says it's lean because the oxygen sensor is not doing anything because it's cold. It's open loop. The oxygen sensor voltage is what it is because it's cold. My garage, my manifold temperature says it's 46, and that's within a degree or two of what my garage was this day. Coolant says it's 73, and that's some error that I've seen in this. I've had 2 coolant sensors in this engine, and it reads high at the low end, and it reads low at the high end. And I can verify that, and I presume it's a scale factor in the scan tool. But be careful, because when I was doing my cam break-in, I boiled the engine over because I couldn't decide between the dash gauge, and it was hitting the red zone, and this factor said I still had 20 degrees to go. I was only like at 240 and the dash is like at 260. And while I was debating between what was correct, it began to boil. So what was correct was the dash gauge. So just be cautious, I would say. Any case, what I also did in these data sets, it was 5 data sets, and they go all the way down here to 60 or 70-ish. It's time. It's time. These data sets go based on time, and then you'll see this column where they reset. And I did some extra calculating. So this one that's cumulative, every time I go to a new data set, this number in the first column resets to 0, and I correct it so that it accumulates and you'll get the full number of seconds through the whole run, minus the amount of time that it took for me to hit the buttons and start a new data set. So interesting thing would be, I was actually a little surprised how fast the engine warms up. This blue spot where it says rich is the first indication that the oxygen sensor is waking up. You'll see that, I've got oxygen sensor millivolts, and you can see it starting to ramp, and you can see cross counts starting to take effect. And I'm still in open loop, but here's the first time it says rich. And so it's only 42 seconds, it was about 40 seconds since I cranked in a cold garage in a 45 degree day. I'm starting to get oxygen sensor warming up and running it at a high idle, of course, because of the scan tool. And then that'll continue down here to the bottom. You'll see it starts showing rich. It's still open loop, but it's starting to respond. The cross count sort of freezes. And I'm not expert on how they do read these cross counts, but what I have sort of learned is if the cross count number stays solid and doesn't change, then that pretty much indicates your oxygen sensor's not active. When I had a faulty sensor and it was getting stuck, I'll call it, and eventually set a diagnostic, those cross counts would go up and it wouldn't update the cross count. It's like you get a stale number until the sensor works again, and then the cross count numbers go up. So that's page 1. Here's page 2, just scrolling it down, so I'm at cumulative time of 70 seconds. And you can see, IAC position has been coming down, pulse width is there, cross counts is still, I'll say, stationary. Coolant temp is starting to move now. And you can go through this page. I'll go through a little quicker. This one is showing mostly it's on the rich side currently. Oxygen sensor is reading, but the engine is still rich, and the millivolts on the O2 sensor are high. And you can see as we get down here to the bottom of the page, now there's a lean, and it goes back to rich. So it looks like it's beginning to switch here at about 2 minutes. So here we're at page 3. To my timing, see here where you see the minus 8.9 to 0. This is where I reset to the next data set. And the minus ones are actually, it's like pre-triggering. I haven't said collect data yet, but I've enabled it. And so it's collecting data before the 0 time when I say go. Anyway, cumulative time here, and you'll see the blue. At this point, I'm at 150 seconds. So that's like 2.5 minutes on a cold start in neutral. And here you'll see it flip to closed loop. And from here on out, it will stay in closed loop, and you can see the oxygen sensor readings are starting to cycle between, rich and lean flags switch, millivolts come across back and forth. The cross counts right about here start to be getting active, and you've gone from where it's kind of stuck to starting to move, and then it resets and starts counting again. So from here out, and again, coolant temp's only 90 degrees, 94 degrees, and that's, accuracy is a little suspect, I know. But from here we're in closed loop and just going to continue to collect data. So here we are at page 4. We're up to 207 seconds. Like I said, still in closed loop, clicking along and warming up. EGR duty cycle through here is 0. It's running rich lean. It's running around 1,000 RPM, again between 9 something and about 1,100. This is that elevated idle that the scan tool induces. Other than that, nothing really major of note. We go up to 277 and I'll switch pages. Here's page 5. There's where I switch another data set. Engine's just continuing to warm up. Everything's looking good. All right, this one is page 6, and we're continuing to accumulate. Pretty stable, running rich lean. Oxygen sensors working, everything's moving forward. Still sitting in park. Here's page 7. Continuing on, we're just accumulating time. Things are stable. Engine is continuing, coolant is continuing to warm up. So here's data page 8. Nothing really important on this page. It's just a continuation of watching the engine warm up, and it's pretty stable right now at idle. This is page 9, and this is where I start to make a change. So you can see right here where it goes to yellow-orange, and it shows the flag goes to reverse drive low. It can't distinguish, it just knows it's not in park neutral. And so at this point I'm dropping it in gear and foot on the brake, and you can see the engine loads up, the mass airflow goes up. So here's page 10 of the data, and you can see at this point I'm accelerating the engine, and the power is coming up. So we were at 12 grams, now we're up to 20. Engine's up to about 13. How far did I go? 1,500, 1,600 RPM. Up against torque converter, you can't hold that very long because the torque converter will get hot. And note the load on the engine, we end up with about 85% duty cycle on the EGR. And then throttle backs off down. So this one's page 11, and you can see at this point I pull it out of gear and go back to park neutral. And then you can watch the TPS here, so 0.53, and you can see that I'm raising the TPS. I was gradually taking the engine speed up, and it ends up going to about 31.75, and then back down again. So you see that response. And again, even in neutral, the EGR picks up and flows. This is the final page, final piece of the data set, and it's back to idle. And at this point, you can see the coolant temperature is up and to its maximum. Manifold air temp is up to 86 Fahrenheit, and idle is pretty stable in the 950-ish, 900 range. So that completes the data set. That's what those look like. Now we're going to move into charts. Looking at all that data as columns of numbers is a little bit, it's hard to internalize and understand. So if you want the detailed data, go back to the spreadsheet. If you kind of want to see the trends and what was going on, this is the entire data set from 0 to, what was it, 700 and some 20 some seconds, I think. And what I've got several charts. The first one is engine speed is on the left-hand y-axis, vertical axis, and the others are plotted on the right-hand side, just so that we get scaling so you can see what's going on. So engine speed is in the blue. You can see here's where we started the engine. The IAC had been up high, and as the engine starts, the IAC comes down and starts controlling. And then as the engine warms up in neutral, you can see the IAC dropping as the engine warms up. Engine speed here, again, you can see it fires up, it flares, it settles out, and until you get further over here to the right. Mass airflow sensor the same way. There's mass airflow pops up, and you can see again as the engine runs, as it warms up, it needs less throttle. It's got less friction, so this airflow drops off just like the IAC. EGR doesn't do anything at this point because you're just idling in neutral. Then at this point here, around just after 500 seconds, I dropped it in gear, and you can see the IAC brings the throttle up a bunch just to take the load up against the transmission. Engine speed drops a little, airflow goes up. At this point is where I'm holding it on the brakes really hard with the left foot and add some throttle. So you can, now the IAC itself goes high. It really doesn't have a particular need to, other than to be ready for when the throttle comes back down again. But you can see engine speed goes up. You can see airflow go up. You can see EGR comes up and peaks and comes back down. And then as I come off the throttle, the IAC comes down and stabilizes and picks it up again as I go back to neutral. And then I use the throttle and slowly bring it up in RPM. You can see the engine come up and drop back down. There's the IAC again. And you can see the airflow go up and come back down. If I take the engine speed out of the way, this is the IAC, mass air, and EGR percent, and it just cleans it up a little bit so you can see the traces better. This one shows TPS, injector pulse width, which is how much fuel. The bigger the pulse width, the more fuel that you'll send to the engine, and then mass airflow on the other side. So you can see TPS across here is flat. The injector pulse width went really high for start, and then came down and runs fairly stable along with that mass airflow while we're just idling. And then again, at this point, we go into gear, and everything starts to respond. TPS, you can see here's where I tipped into the throttle and did the brake torque, and then I tipped in at a similar amount to rev it in neutral. You can see the airflow go through a cycle. These are the oxygen sensor parameters along with engine speed. So here's the engine speed trace. We start, we idle. Here's that brake torque section. Here's revving in neutral. And here's the oxygen sensor, as it's warming up, the voltage comes up as it's warming up. And here's where you start seeing activity here. Again, less than 3 minutes. And here the oxygen sensor is going through its oscillations and the cross counts. And as I said earlier, I'm not an expert on how these cross counts work. It looks like it cross counts until it gets up to a particular level, resets to 0, and starts cycling through again. And the main thing I always watch for is just that it's continuing to accumulate those counts. My final chart is just the temperatures. This is what they look like plotted out. So this bottom one is the manifold air temperature, the inlet air, and it runs through its cycle. And then here is the coolant temp that is starting obviously high and then is ending low. And from everything I can tell, I think the sensor is reading correctly. I think the ECM is reading it and interpreting it correctly. I don't send any diagnostics for incorrect coolant temperature for things not coming up up to temperature, staying too cold. Everything from a diagnostics is normal. So I read this as some kind of I'm going to call it an error in the data that gets sent out to the scan tool, or how the scan tool reads it. So it's just, if you're using the tool, don't be surprised the coolant temperature isn't spot on in this package. Maybe yours will be, but mine certainly hasn't been. And as I said, 30-year-old sensor, a brand new sensor, it does exactly the same thing. Now, the last thing I'm going to note is that I'm showing you all this data and it's in video form, which makes it sometimes a little hard to work with. I do have a Dropbox account, and I'm going to post a link in the comments section for this video that will give you a link to my Dropbox account, to a shared folder which will pull this folder out, and you can look at the charts and you can have the raw data and do what you wish with it. So I hope that helps you.
Now that we've had a look at the data, that's kind of a good standard set. I'll just remind people that, one more time, that the car is a 1985 305 tune port injection. It's been rebuilt to stock specs with the exception of a Lunati cam, a mild cam, and the calibrations in the computer are stock. I've not changed any of the prom or anything. So the only thing that would be, I'll call it, might be a shift from production, is that there's just a little bit more duration in the cam, but it's actually not far away from stock. And so it ought to be a good piece, because I started from stone cold and was able to get it warmed up and get it all the way up onto the thermostat before I ran out of time on the tool. And you can see how that performs. You can see how it performed with a little bit of power on it. And granted, I was just brake torquing it with my left foot and the parking brake set. But hopefully it gets you some usable data that will provide a reference for your car.